Hello, everyone, and welcome to Under the Rainbow, How History is Made. My name is Andrew Schaefer, and I'm the Director of Development and Communications and interim co-executive director at the GLBT Historical Society. I want to thank you for joining us here today and begin by acknowledging that the GLBT Historical Society is located on Ohlone tribal land. I invite any Indigenous folks with us today to make themselves visible in the chat and to be recognized as we honor the contemporary and ancestral lives of America's Indigenous peoples. This event is being recorded and will be posted to our YouTube channel and our website. If you're watching live, we welcome your active participation in the chat and encourage you to post comments, observations, and questions for our great panelists. Before I introduce tonight's speakers, I want to tell you a little bit about the Society and the work that we do. Founded in 1985, the GLBT Historical Society is recognized internationally as a leader in the field of LGBTQ public history. Our mission is to collect, preserve, exhibit, and make accessible to the public materials and knowledge to support and promote understanding of LGBTQ history, culture, and arts in all their diversity. It's a mouthful, but that's what we do. We operate 2 facilities in San Francisco, the GLBT Historical Society Museum, located in the heart of the Castro District. When it opened 10 years ago, it was the first standalone museum of LGBTQ history and culture anywhere in the United States. We also operate the John B. Decheco Archives and Research Center in the Mid-Market District, which serves hundreds of researchers every year. If you've been to our museum, you know it's on the small side, just 1,600 square feet. And that's why we've been working for most of the last 5 years toward our goal of opening a much larger facility that can share even more of our stories. You can help us achieve these goals by becoming a card-carrying member of the GLBT Historical Society. In addition to helping us keep our history alive, members get a variety of perks, including 20% discount to our museum store, free year-round access to the museum, and invitations to special members-only events. You can learn more about how to become a member and other ways to support the society by visiting glbthistory.org/join-give. Tonight's event is inspired by our acquisition earlier this year of a truly extraordinary object. After many, many, many months of behind-the-scenes work, this June we unveiled the only known remnant of the original rainbow flags, just in time for Pride Month. If you've been to our museum since then, you've seen the flag as displayed here, carefully preserved behind glass and folded gently to display all 8 of the original colors. When we revealed the flag, we were bombarded with questions, primarily around where the flag had been and how we found it. It's a long, complicated journey, and there have been dozens of articles written on the subject already, so I won't get into the whole story. But the response got us thinking that maybe this was an opportunity to talk not just about this object, but about how organizations like ours preserve and share countless historic objects and the stories that they can allow us to tell. That's where tonight's event came from, and I'm so excited to have such a great panel of experts who can walk us through the life cycle of historic objects, from authentication and contextualization to exhibition and preservation. Before I introduce tonight's panelists, I have to thank a couple of people who are really instrumental in this process, and without whom the flag would probably still be in a storage unit, or even worse. First, I have to thank Charlie Beal. Lee, if you can toss up the next picture. I love this picture of Charlie. Charlie, if you're here, feel free to make yourself known in the chat. He's the president of the Gilbert Baker Foundation. I've been working with Charlie for about a year now, and his enthusiasm for the flag and for preserving his friend Gilbert's legacy is truly incredible. I strongly encourage you to check out gilbertbaker.com to learn more about the flag creator and how they're working to keep his memory alive. Second, you can toss up the next picture. I want to thank Terry Beswick, our former executive director, seen here showing off the flag to a few familiar faces when we unveiled it in June. Terry's leadership over the last 5 years has been truly instrumental in preserving not only this flag, but thousands of other objects that would be lost to history without him and an organization like ours to keep them around. I encourage you to check out our webpage, glbthistory.org/rainbow-flag. We have very long web pages to learn more about the flag's origins and to read about the Rainbow Flag History Project, which seeks to provide future researchers with more contextual information about this priceless artifact. Now, without further ado, I am beyond excited to welcome tonight's panelists to the virtual stage. Please join me in welcoming Jim Ferrigan, Eric Gonzaba, and Melissa Leviton. Here they come. Hello, hello, hello. Jim is an expert vexillologist, which is a word that I did not know until about a year ago, but it means flag expert, who worked with Gilbert Baker and is joining us here to talk about how historic objects are authenticated. Eric Gonzaba is a historian and professor of American Studies at CSU Fullerton He's also the founder of Wearing Gay History and Mapping Gay Guides, interactive public history projects that contextualize ephemeral pieces of queer culture. He's joining us to talk about how historians make sense of historic objects and how they contextualize them. And lastly, Melissa Leviton is a founding partner of Curates Group. I don't know if I'm saying that right, but please feel free to correct me. Close enough?
Close enough.
Yeah. Museum consultants and appraisers, and the former curator in charge of textiles at the Fine Arts Museums of San Francisco. She's joining us to talk about the process of exhibition and preservation, how we make sure that historic objects are displayed well and stick around for future generations to enjoy. Each of these speakers has very lengthy CVs, and you can read their full bios in the description below. So that's as far as I'll go for now. But would y'all like to say hello to our guests?
Hi, everyone. It's great to be with you all.
Good evening.
Hello, everyone.
Wonderful. We have a really great panel, and we've got some really great presentations coming up. So without further ado, Jim, the floor is yours if you want to take it away.
Well, thank you, Andrew. Good evening, everyone. I'm going to talk a little bit about the life of the object. And before I get into it, I just want to say that one of the clients I have is the largest private flag collection in the country. It's the Zerkor flag collection. And there are about 3,000 pieces in the Zerkor collection. And it's a dynamic collection. It's a working collection. And we try and learn what we can from the objects. So in this case, this object will have, or will go through several manifestations. And that's what we do in the museum world to preserve those for posterity. And I'm going to put them in sort of an order, but they all kind of overlap. Preservation, conservation, which includes documentation, interpretation, exhibition, and then most importantly, education. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about how the flag was preserved and then how it was conserved and documented. So I knew about the flag because I worked in San Francisco. I was the manager of the flag store for Paramount Flag Company, and Gilbert worked with me. We worked together for about 10 years. In 1978 parade, a rainbow flag was made, and it was displayed and then taken down. And it wasn't actually ever displayed again. And so I became always very curious about what happened to the original 1978 rainbow flag. It turns out it was poorly preserved or poorly stored, and it was damaged. Gilbert eventually reacquired it and preserved it and removed some of the damaged portions. And then when Gilbert died, the flag kind of vanished. And I was wondering what had happened to this fragment of the original rainbow flag. And that kind of had always been in the back of my mind. In 2019, I heard about the exhibit in New York City, and there was a newspaper article saying that this fragment was going to be displayed, and I became very curious. So I got a hold of the Gilbert Baker Foundation. Specifically, I got a hold of Charlie Beale, and we corresponded, we talked, and then eventually in February of 2020, he arranged for me to come down to San Francisco, and he arranged for space and a hotel, and we laid it out and looked at it. And I was able to take some specific measurements, do some fabric examination, and actually just kind of let the piece talk to me. What can the flag tell me? And what it told me was that I was looking at a flag that was well made, but not professionally made. It hadn't been made by a flag company. A flag that had been vernacular, as we say in the trade, not made professionally, but by people skilled with the needle or skilled with the sewing machine. There were also then some additions to the flag, some alterations that had been made. And these were all consistent with what I knew about the history of the piece. In other words, that it had been reinforced by professionals at the Paramount Flag Company. And so I was able to differentiate the work that had been done by the makers and then the work that had later been done by Paramount Flag so that would facilitate display. And what had been done was to reinforce the hoist of the flag and grommet it and stitch it on one of Paramount's industrial machines. So since I had been at Paramount when this occurred, I was able to corroborate that the work was in fact Paramount's, that I was looking at a vernacular fragment of an 8-stripe rainbow flag made completely out of cotton, and document the flag to be that surviving fragment of the 1978 rainbow flag. And that was very exciting because for years it had been thought to have been completely lost. And so I wrote up a treatment on it, basically a condition report for the Gilbert Baker Foundation. And the idea is to, as I said earlier, let the flag talk to us, tell us what it can in its physical state, because flags are silent witnesses to history. They were there. And so it's up to us to be able to interpret these and then use these to further the story that we're going to tell with the exhibition. So that in a nutshell is what my role was, is to examine, study, document, and then provide authentication that the artifact is indeed what it is purported to be, the only remaining fragment of the 1978 flag. I can't underscore how important it is, because actual flag material culture, actual surviving flags from 1978 to 1981 are exceedingly rare. There are newspapers, there are surviving T-shirts and other ephemera from the parades, but there's very few flags. And this is really the truly significant, because very rarely in a movement is the first flag preserved. So that was my role, and I'd be happy to answer questions in the chat, but I'm more than happy now to turn it over to Eric, who will talk to us a little bit about how we interpret these pieces, how we put them in context, and how they fit into the larger narrative. So thank you, Andrew. And Eric.
Thank you so much. Well, good evening, everyone. I want to thank the GLBT Historical Society for this very, very kind invitation to speak with all of you tonight, and especially to Andrew and Lee, who have helped organize this panel. And I want to say it's quite an honor to speak alongside my panelists, who are just fabulous at what they do. It is not every day I get to listen to a vexillologist. I've also learned that word recently, and an archival preservation expert. So tonight is a real treat for me, and I really want to thank everyone. I have not seen the exhibition, but I will not lie to you. I am dying to get to San Francisco when it gets a little safer, and definitely come to see it in person, because it is on the top of my agenda. So for my 10 minutes, I've been asked to speak a little bit about the importance of material culture and how historians contextualize objects. And as I sat down to ponder this question before this talk, and I promise you I have sat down to ponder this question, I tried to think about just how unique and exciting the acquiring of the original Baker flag is to our national and our international queer culture. Now, material culture, or just the study of physical evidence of the human experience, is a vast field of inquiry, and one that cannot be condensed down to 10 minutes. So I won't even try to do that. But I'll just start by saying this. So much of the historical analysis that we do can't be limited to traditional sources that historians have long utilized to try to make sense of the past. Most historians spend most of their time reading, textual documents to understand historical subjects. Sources like newspapers and personal diaries, governmental records, memoirs, scientific studies, other things like this. And while it makes sense why historians focus on these types of records, right? While they aren't always the easiest to read, these textual documents, or the most thrilling kinds of sources, they do offer so much personal substance for actual people and about the actual people who wrote them, right? And so much that the story of history is about actual people, it makes sense that historians focus on written words that past actors have left behind for all of us to ponder, right? But as you probably can guess, what I'm about to say next is that textual documents are often not sufficient in any historian's work, at least by themselves. Sometimes we need to know more about our historical subjects than what they have left behind to tell us, partly because those individuals in the past didn't always bother to leave us their full stories, or they couldn't leave us their full stories for whatever reason, maybe out of fear or of educational limitations, right? And so to look for a more complete context about our past, we look to everyday objects that made up people's lives to try to make sense of those people's wider worlds and their wider lived experiences. And some of the objects that I'm thinking of are just practical parts of people's lives that can really tell us more about the periods in which they live. So I'll give you some very, very brief examples. To take one example, the huge number of artificial limbs we have in the mid-19th century in museums all around the country. While prosthetic limbs date back long before the US Civil War, the huge number of amputees following the war, coupled with the federal government's payouts to veterans who secure these items, tell us of the war's gruesome nature and the regard of the government to compensate soldiers following their service. Just one small example. Or take the material culture of enslaved people, right? So many historians must rely on scant written records we have from the perspective of actual enslaved African Americans themselves versus the copious amount of records we have from the perspective of like white enslavers, right? But sometimes we can see in the tools and the clothing of enslaved people a continued attention to African customs, evidence that, slavery didn't totally destroy the generational links that Black enslaved people had to their homelands, the same homelands that white enslavers had violently kidnapped them from, right? And while most of us know that Black enslaved people built so much of the physical infrastructure of this American nation, its governmental buildings and even the White House, right? It's in the physical materials of these structures that we see more evidence of the literal Black foundation that this nation stands on, right? Take Jefferson's plantation in Monticello. I was just there a couple of years ago before the pandemic. I took this picture on the right. Etched into the original bricks that form the foundation of Jefferson's estates are fingerprints of the quote servants, his words, right? We know they're enslaved people, the servants who erected Jefferson's main house. And those fingerprints of servants of enslaved people were unconsciously left on these bricks, not chosen to represent enslaved people. It was happenstance, right? But they still stand, these fingerprints stand as irrefutable evidence of an ugly past that we ought not to ignore. But returning to our LGBTQ past, what role does material culture play in telling our recent stories, right? The stories of the last 100 or 200 years? Well, it's not until the 1970s and the 1980s that the queer people really began believing that their stories mattered enough to be in the historical records. And so much of the early work done on LGBTQ history in the United States was based on the documents and material culture consciously saved by queer activists. Here on your screen is a photograph of historians marching at the 1984 San Francisco Pride Parade. Early groups like this popped up all across the country. Groups in Washington, D.C. began forming gay historical societies, in Houston, in Minneapolis, right? And the LGBTQ documents, ephemera, and material culture that they helped save now serves as the bedrock of queer historical scholarship that historians and public historians and tour guides around the country use to try to tell the queer past to the wider public. And just like with any other group who might not have left us plethora of textual documents, the same issue we have when trying to tell the histories of people like Civil War soldiers or enslaved people, right? We can learn a lot more about LGBT Americans and their culture by looking at the stuff. And I love that word, right? Because it's a perfect word to describe all the material that historians use to tell the past, all the stuff that our queer brethren left behind, whether it was consciously saved or not. And so how are we supposed to place Gilbert Baker's flag in context, right? And why does it even matter? Well, sometimes material culture matters because the material in question simply matters to the person who used it, right? Gilbert's Baker flag mattered to him, and it mattered to so many other people, millions of people around the globe. Certainly, the multicolored rainbow flag mattered to Baker, who set out to create a recognizable symbol for gay and later queer communities. So many former symbols used by gay men and lesbian women before the flag were not really well known to non-LGBTQ audiences. It was kind of a coded strategy to stay hidden. I'm thinking here of symbols like the labyrinth, the symmetrical double-sided axe that's on your screen, and the lambda symbol in red, commonly used by queer people, gay men and lesbian women. Now, before Baker's rainbow flag took center stage after its creation in the late 1970s that Jim just talked about, LGBTQ communities reclaimed other symbols like the pink triangle on the right side of your screen, used by the Nazis in the Second World War to identify gay prisoners. But Baker's flag was meant to symbolize something not so rooted in tragedy and discrimination, right? But one that could be used, it can be seen as a symbol of hope, of joy, right? Of happiness. And Baker probably had no idea just how popular the symbol would become. But we historians should ponder why so many queer people actually became fixated with this symbol all around the globe, not just in San Francisco, but all around the United States and the wider world. Maybe it's just me, but the rainbow I thought might be easily seen as just a hideous kind of symbol, a tacky symbol, right? Like, I mean, what really goes with the rainbow? What are you going to wear with it, right? But regardless, Baker's bold color combination just really draws attention to the person who's wearing that symbol or waving that symbol, right? It's a sort of in-your-face symbol that couldn't easily be ignored. And if that was Baker's intention, it certainly seemed to work. As everything under the sun in the month of June in the United States, every corporation seems to be painting everything they own with rainbow colors in honor of Baker's original design. It's just one example of queer material culture that can shine more on the incredible histories that queer people have created and they've endured. Material culture adds nuance and complexities to our narratives. I'm going to take two examples in my own work that I see this kind of material culture in action. I'm going to start talking about first about textual sources, but I think when we think about sources both as text and also as material culture, we can understand how incredible some of our queer material culture really can be. Some of the viewers who are watching this program might be familiar with these Bob Dameron address books. I have a copy of them on the screen today. I have one here as well. These were gay travel guides that began being published for particularly gay men beginning in the early 60s. This one was published in 1964, the first one. And these address books contained all types of listings for gay-friendly bars, for restaurants, bathhouses, public cruising grounds in every state, and eventually in later issues of the guide all around the globe. But the early guides in the 60s and 1970s measured very small. They only measured about 12 centimeters, less than 5 inches, very tiny, right? And part of this makes sense. They were travel guides. They were meant to be moved around all over when you're traveling the country or the world, and you would want to be able to slip it in your suit pocket or in your pocket of your jeans or whatever, right, for convenience. But their small size was also a nod to the secrecy that they needed to be secured in by the people who were traveling with it. As you can probably note on your screen, no early iteration of the guide, the Dameron address books, had any suggestion on the outside cover of the book, at least, that it had anything to do with gay people. No lambda symbols, not the word gay, certainly not Baker's rainbow flag. Some of that makes sense, right? Some of this predates Baker's rainbow flags, right? So can we draw from this one piece of historical queer material culture that gays and lesbians living in the 50s or the 60s or the 70s lived all a secretive life, mostly stuck in those miserable closets? Well, of course not, right? We have plenty of queer material culture that suggests that many queer people living in the past were living fulfilling, negotiated, sure, but many of them were living fulfilling, negotiated lives. Some of them unafraid to live lives as open as possible wherever they were living, whether living in San Francisco, in the Castro district, or were living in a private rural life in Tuttle, Idaho, for instance. Before I conclude, I also want to turn to another project that I work on, which is called Wearing Gay History. It's a free online archive, and it looks about how LGBTQ history and culture can be seen through the material cultures of the inexpensive t-shirt. Now, some of my favorite t-shirts in the archive stem from the Anita Bryant campaigns. And just a quick overview for those of you younger people in the room who may not be familiar who Anita Bryant was. Anita Bryant was this famous singer, and she eventually becomes a brand ambassador for the Florida Citrus Commission, where she started marketing orange juice. And if that's not weird enough, she becomes a huge opponent of gay rights in 1977 when she began what will become known as the Save Our Children campaign, which is aimed to repeal pro-gay rights laws in many cities across the country, most notably in her citrus state of Florida, in Dade County of Florida, which had a pro-gay rights law at the time. And she was very successful in her effort at Dade County, but many historians note that her campaign helped spur a more national, a gay political movement, as it was such a national news event, not just like major news events before this that were more like localized, like local bar raids, local discrimination suits. And the shirts discussing the Anita Bryant campaign are just downright vulgar and lovely, if you ask me. But they also speak to how quickly after Stonewall, less than a decade, right, were gays and lesbians and transgender and bisexual folks expressing their culture and their politics quite literally on their sleeve, right? Some of these shirts read, "Get a grip, Anita. Let she who's without sin cast the first orange. May the great seagull of P-Town shit on Anita." There are many, many more. You can definitely check them out if you're interested. They're all incredible. No matter what you think of homosexuals, you have to hand it to them. They do love their puns, right? But for a movement so obsessed with the notion of the closet, these activist t-shirts, these pieces of material culture serve as an annoyingly good metaphor of a community that was not always in silence or in hiding, right? I am out of time, but I just want to close by saying that we are at an exciting time in crafting our collective LGBTQ experiences and our histories. I think the GLBT Historical Society's acquisition of the original Pride flag helps remind us that visibility was a cornerstone of the gay rights movement in San Francisco, and a notion that would spread to similar LGBTQ movements across the country, and of course, in fact, all over the world, right? LGBTQ people have already won the battle of convincing the public that their histories matter, right? That is in no doubt. Now our mission is to continue pushing to explore the more nuances that make up our fascinating lives of our diverse queer communities. And while we ought not to stay in the closet, we should certainly raid our closets and find new ways of making sense of the queer culture that is all around us. I want to thank you all for listening to me, and now I'm going to hand it over to the brilliant Professor Melissa Leviton. Thank you all.
Thank you, Eric. You are a tough act to follow, but it is my pleasure to run the anchor lap for this program. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit about what curators do. I'm not the curator of the flag exhibition that is currently at the museum, but I've been a longtime textile curator, and I can tell you that curators are very particular kinds of storytellers. Eric mentioned stuff. What we do is we tell stories with stuff, we tell stories about stuff, and we tell stories about the people who make the stuff. So stuff is what makes all of us just breathe a little faster. It's the staff of life. So when you're organizing an exhibition for any museum, large, small, or medium-sized, you're faced with the question of what kind of story or stories are you going to tell in this exhibition? Sometimes you know going in that you have a particular story and you are going to tell it. If it's an exhibition all about the life and work of one particular person, then you know you're likely to start with the beginnings of their career, and then through their adolescent phase and their mature phase, and finally to, the highlight of whatever it is. That's very linear, and those kinds of shows are very easy. But much more often, you develop the story as you go along, as you do your own research, and as you bring in people like Eric and Jim, who have done in-depth research or who have very specific pockets of knowledge to be contributors, or to, at the very least, help you understand what's important about the story that you are going to be telling, and also to help guide you to the material objects that are going to be available for you to use And sometimes, if the actual thing is not available, you can use substitutes. You can use photographs. You can use videos. You can use holograms. You can use reproductions. You can use all sorts of supplementary materials, but at some point or another, you have got to have the real thing for people actually to look at and experience. And so you, as curator, essentially act like the conductor of the orchestra. You decide which instruments are going to be playing in which parts of the exhibition, and you figure out how to put it all together for your specific audience. And figuring out who your audience is and how best to approach them is a big part of the process. So usually you're going to have more than one story option, and maybe you want to tell more than one story. But part of the process involves choosing among them, and that's going to depend on a host of other considerations. What else is going on in your museum or your gallery at that time? Is this part of a museum-wide effort that is going to sort of give you an overall framework that you have to fit into? That will shape your story in certain ways. How interested are the museum's visitors going to be in all of these different stories? And who are the museum's visitors? Are they locals? Are they tourists? Are they only people from the LGBTQ community? Who are they? And understanding who you think is likely to walk through the door and see your exhibition is also going to influence the choices that you make. What's available and what's not available. You might want to get one of those fabulous Auntie Anita Bryant t-shirts that Eric showed a few minutes ago, but maybe they're not available. Maybe nobody will lend to you. And it also takes time. You've got to find things. You've got to track down their owners. If you're borrowing from an institution, then usually you need to tell them at least 6 months in advance what you want. And you have to prove to them that your facilities are an appropriate place for them to lend their precious objects to you. And sometimes they say no. And then you have to find something else that you can put in its place. So it's one of the reasons that exhibitions take a very long time to develop. I've done them as quickly as 11 months, nearly killed me. But much more often we prefer to have minimum 18 months, 2 years, 3 years is great. Some of them take 5 or even more years. And you can be negotiating with lenders and looking for objects right up until pretty close to the end. So it's a complex process of story development, object location, and figuring out how they are all going to go together, speak to each other, and also speak to the particular story that you want to tell in your exhibition. So in the case of the rainbow flag, there are just endless stories that might be told, and you don't have to tell them all at once. You can if you want. If you have a large space and you want to do a major exhibition and mount all sorts of supporting programs, maybe you want to actually do it all in one huge installation. But maybe you want to be able to get this flag out once a year for 5 years or 10 years, and you've got 5 or 10 different stories to tell, and every time it comes out, you tell a different one. That's also a possibility. So maybe you want to do an installation about how it got made, who was responsible for making it. That would bring in a lot of the work that Jim has done. How the idea of using the rainbow came about. How about the history of the adoption of the flag? Why did it become important? Who kind of rallied under that flag and why? Again, in many cases, back to the work that Jim has done. The meaning to the community, both originally in 1978 and over the decades since then. How has it grown? How has it changed? What kind of other community symbols have grown up? And what kind of relationship does the rainbow flag have to them? The kind of work that Eric does. It's rediscovery. How did it get from Gilbert Baker to the museum? Where did it go along the way? What's its history? What can you construct? What can't you construct? And why? Is the flag that the museum has truly authentic? I know that Jim has authenticated it. Does everybody agree? Are there legitimate questions about whether or not it is the original flag? I don't know the answers to those questions, but if those questions exist, then perhaps an installation could explore those. And then people are also fascinated by the materials and the care and the feeding, which brings me to the question of preservation. Textiles are kind of fragile little critters. They like stable temperatures and stable relative humidity. Ideally, they're going to be approximately 68 to 72 degrees Fahrenheit, plus or minus 5 degrees. That's been the gold standard for a long time. Relative humidity will be about 55%, plus or minus 5%. That's also been the gold standard for a long time. But, you know, if you can't quite do that, because many museums can't, then it's better to have your environment be stable wherever it is. The worst possible thing you can do is to have your object in a situation where it's desert one month and it's pouring with rain the next month, and the humidity goes like this, way up. Because as the temperature goes up and down, and as the relative humidity goes up and down, the fibers in that textile expand and contract and expand and contract and expand and contract, and that ages them. So you don't necessarily want to age them in that way. You like to keep it in the dark, ideally to limit its time on display, and to keep it in storage in the dark for at least an equal amount of time to the time it's been out in the light on display every day. Most museums that can control their lighting keep their lighting on textiles and works on paper, things like photographs, drawings, prints, at 5 to 7 foot candles. That's a specific measure of light intensity. 5 to 7 foot candles of light, which is not a lot of light. Your eyes have to adjust. You like to keep the environment clean and the object clean, if you possibly can. You like to keep insects at bay. This flag is cotton. And so fortunately, it is not subject to damage mostly by clothes moths, which are all over the place in San Francisco, but they eat protein fibers. They eat silk and wool and hair and fur and feathers. Not the problem with this flag, but silverfish love cellulose, and cotton is a cellulose fiber. So you need to make sure that there aren't any silverfish floating around and other kinds of pests like rodents, which again, none of us want in our houses or our museums, but we do need to actively push back on the populations that exist around humans, because they can do quite a lot of damage as well. So those are some of the things that you need to do to preserve the textile, which means it's not necessarily going to be on display all the time. The final piece of this process of exhibition is interpretation. You need to figure out how to convey all of the information that you have gathered from all of the books and sources that you have found to members of the public in a very concise and very easily digestible way. So the curator's job is to figure out how to interpret. So you write the text panels, you write the individual labels that go with each object. And most museums have requirements that are pretty stringent. Your introductory panel should be 200 words maximum, maybe 250 if you're really being expansive. Your individual section panels, 150 words, perhaps no more than 3 paragraphs. Each individual label, 60 to 100 words, and the vocabulary should be pitched at an 8th grade reading level, so people of all ages and language attainments can read them and understand them. But also you need to install your exhibition in a way that can speak to people who don't read labels. Roughly half the people who walk into museums never read a word, and the other half read everything obsessively. So you need to try and cater to both types of visitor. So you need to do a lot of anticipation of how the visitor is going to consume the information you are presenting, and try and meet them to the greatest degree possible where they are and hook them into the story that you are telling. So with that, I'd like to hand this back over to Andrew for the panel portion of our program.
Thank you. That was really interesting. We can bring the whole gang back on screen now. Hello, everyone. I just want to again thank you all for sharing your expertise and your knowledge with us tonight. It's been really interesting. My background is training in history, and I'm even taken away by how much work goes into this process. The years and years for every single object we see at a museum. It's years or even decades of work behind the scenes by experts in very specific niche fields of knowledge. So I'm very grateful for all of you and for the work you do. I do want to encourage folks, if you have questions, to drop them into the chat. We've got a little bit of That was not my motorcycle. I don't know whose that was. I wish I had one. We've got a couple of questions that came in advance, but we've got a little bit of time for extra questions. But before I get into some questions, any thoughts or questions from our esteemed panelists to one another? You also
the only thing building on what Melissa said, one of the problems we have with flags is depending on what fabric it is, we have a space problem or real estate problem, as we like to say, because if it's silk, pretty much we want those to be flat and not upright. And depending on whether they're framed or not, and if they are framed, what kind of frame? Is it a conservation environment, or is it something from Aaron Brothers or Michaels that you're probably going to have to redo because they didn't use archival material? So these are some of the other questions you get when you get into long-term storage. There's a 13-star flag up in a museum in upstate New York that's been in a glass frame so long that the glass itself has photochemically reacted with the dyes in the wool, and the design of the flag has etched into the glass.
Wow.
And so
that's impressive.
Yeah, well, and it's a reactive environment because the back of it is wrapping paper and cardboard. And so when I saw it, I said the first thing you need to do is undo all this. So
it's about the worst thing you can do.
Absolutely, yeah. The only thing you can do is put it outside in direct sunlight.
Yeah, in its acidic environment. Yeah, that's true. I mean, you can also roll pieces that have not been mounted on rigid mounts, which can help to mitigate the space problem, although they do take up space. So
our real estate problem is well, for any museum, most people don't really realize it. The most valuable resource a museum has is shelves. And,
absolutely.
Because at any given time, 2.5% to 3% is going to be on display, and the rest is in long-term storage. And so, and as you said, it's got to be temperature and humidity controlled. It's got to be rodent and vermin free, preferably secure. Textiles have very little intrinsic value. All their value is extrinsic to what the culture says. I was on the panel for the Star Spangled Banner in '96, And I said, look, unless you make education a part of this project,
Mhm.
what you have is 40 pounds of hair from dead sheep.
There are some textiles that do have materials that have intrinsic
Yes.
value,
Yeah,
but
actually, yeah.
but you're right that most of them it's extrinsic.
Yeah, actually, one of the most unusual ones is U.S. presidential flags from about the 1890s till President Nixon. The fringe was actually made of silver and gold bullion,
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah.
and so there's a dual problem there because the bullion is so heavy, and so if you're going to exhibit it, you got a problem there. So and that people have removed the fringe from those flags because it is so valuable.
Yeah, which has, both pros and cons. When you've got really heavy fringe, what you need is a slant deck.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
But that
Yeah.
also takes up lots of space.
So it's a giant big puzzle what we do and how we do it.
It is
So
indeed.
and then how to over time how to interpret it and then sometimes reinterpret.
Mhm.
So that's why I liked your presentation so much here. So
Very interesting. I want to give a little bit of time for some of the questions that came in. So Jim, you mentioned in your presentation about the grommets and like the hoist on the original flag being really important in the authentication. And we got a question around that. Like what are you looking for when you're looking at, the flag objects? What questions are you asking? What are you looking for to determine, this is this flag versus any other flag? So why were those things so important?
yeah, the reason why it was so important to me is for two reasons. One, if a flag is professionally made, they will generally have a certain type of hoist, especially for outdoor use. And so when I look at it, I can tell or I can deduce what the intent of the maker was. Now, in the case of the rainbow flag, Gilbert did not put a hoist on his flag. What he did was he just turned the edge and ran the stitch line up it. And when he did his test flight before the parade, they realized that was the weakest point because that was the stress point. And so they knew that would not take San Francisco winds. And those two poles at UN Plaza, I mean, those flags for the most part are straight out. And so that's when he went to the flag company to have a hoist added. And what they recommended is rather than add a canvas hoist, they turned the hoist on itself to make a sleeve. And in that sleeve, they put a rope. And then the rope's ends were doubled back on themselves to make loops. That was then sewn into place with a commercial machine. And then the hoist itself was reinforced with zigzags. So here in this flag, I have the vernacular stitching that was done by Gilbert and the other people at the Gay Artists Cooperative on Grove Street, and then the commercial stitching that was easily identifiable that had been done by the Paramount Flag Company. And since I knew that was part of the flag story, that was one of the things I was looking for. Also, Paramount used a common but distinctive 0.75-inch grommet in that era, and that's exactly what's on that flag. So although there's no maker's mark on the flag and there's no identifying mark on the grommet, they conform to the known grommets being used by Paramount at that time.
It's so interesting that this amateur flag making and sort of the fallout of that 40 years later ends up helping us understand like, oh, it's that one, because they really did not, these were not expert flag makers. They were, even if you look at it, one of my favorite things I like to point out when I am able to give people a quick tour of the museum is like, you look at the colors and they are faded and inconsistent. It looks almost like tie-dye because that's like the people who are making the flag, they were experts in tie-dye. They were not experts in flag making.
And when you examine the one repair, the hue and chroma that varies as a result of the dyeing process, that panel, that repair piece matches. So clearly that was done either shortly after or at the time of manufacture. So, and the stitching matches. So you can tell, just to come out of that for a moment, I was looking at a flag from the USS Constitution. It's a 28-star flag, yard made, meaning it was made at the Navy Yard, probably in Charleston, outside Boston. And that was fine. And the construction was uniform throughout, except for 2 stars. And they're clearly added. Now, if you look at the bulk of the yard made flags, all the stitching is about 12 stitches per inch. That's a skilled seamstress or seamster. The other 2 stars, one had 6 stitches to the inch, the other one had 8. That's probably somebody with all thumbs or the big fat hands of a sailmaker at sea. I believe those 2 stars were added when the Constitution made its round the world cruise, when she was off of Hawaii and she got news that more states had been added to the Union. And so that corroborates the story that came with the flag. The flag itself can talk to us and say, yeah, that's what happened.
That's so interesting. You guys have such fun jobs. I'm very jealous. Very rarely do I get to do this kind of fun stuff. But when I do, it's always a treat. Eric, we got another question that's mostly for you, but also for anyone. What kind of questions, when you're looking at some of these historic objects, what are the questions you're taking to them? Obviously, it's like, how big is this? What does it look like? But, as a historian, what are the questions you're taking to these objects to be able to understand and contextualize them?
Sure. It's not like this is going to sound cliche. It's not really, there are questions that we all are thinking, and they seem so obvious, and yet sometimes the answers are more pointed or mysterious. For instance, so we're asking who wrote this document, right? And sometimes it's very easy. Sometimes it's very easy to know these things, right? But I mentioned, I do T-shirts. I collect and trying to understand, global history and hidden histories or ignored histories of queer people, looking at activist T-shirts. And sometimes you come across a T-shirt that may be the only surviving artifact of whatever it's about, right? So, so many of these T-shirts are involving gay bars, for instance, right? And if anyone knows the fleeting nature of gay bars in this country, bars will come up and they will die within a couple of weeks. And so sometimes the only surviving records we have left are not, liquor licenses, which are destroyed after a couple decades, or ephemera that's been destroyed in newspapers or whatnot. It's some of these surviving shirts or what people kept in their households, right? And so it's kind of, for me, the fun thing about being a historian is trying to be that, I don't want to give credence to bad history, right? But the national treasure of the world, right? Is to think of yourself as kind of an explorer, and you're touching an artifact for the first time that you don't have a lot of meaning to it. That's the fun stuff, right? That's the fun stuff to really get to start digging about and trying to figure out how it fits into the history of a certain site or the history of a certain country or whatnot. But you're coming to questions. A lot of things I look for. You're looking for symbols. You're looking for, if you know who created something, when, what kind of era. One of the easiest, and Melissa can talk more about this as a preservationist, is that it helps a lot when you know if something is from the 1950s versus the 1940s versus the 1980s. These are very different eras. You can look for different symbols. The way people discuss their environments changes, right? Colors change. I'm just talking about T-shirts here. It's I noticed that a lot more shirts that tend to be white or black tend to be later in the 2000s when, many of these shirts are becoming more manufactured. It's cheaper to print on white or black fabric, mass produced. Many of the T-shirts that I deal with from the 60s and the 70s and 80s, these are shirts that are hand printed. And so people are much more willing to play with colors and whatnot. It's a more of exciting time back then. So the historians do a lot of the who, what, when, where, why questions. Cliche, but it's the good bedrock of all historical scholarship, I think.
I would totally echo that. And especially when I'm dealing with clothing, I want to know, where'd you get it? Why did you buy it? Did somebody give it to you? Why did you keep it? If it's old, if you've had it lying around for, 20 or 30 years, what was important about this to you that made you hang on to it? Where did you use it, or where did you wear it? And in a lot of ways, it's also, who are you within this community? Why do you have this? You know, is my Anita Bryant t-shirt more or less significant than your Anita Bryant t-shirt? So trying to build the whole picture for the object is really important. And oftentimes people, if it's something that they themselves purchased and used, they can tell you a lot, but things that come down in families that then, you know, come out to you later on, oftentimes they don't know. So it's great to gather the information they have, but it can also be really frustrating because a lot of people can't tell you a lot.
Totally. And, you know, and Jim and Melissa mentioned this point earlier, is that, you know, it would be amazing if we could keep everything owned by queer people in the past to be able to tell the complete stories of everyone in the future. But the limitations of space in archives around the country just make that impossible. And so archivists have to make really, really difficult decisions about what they keep, how much they keep, right? And Melissa makes a good point. You know, a lot of the stuff that we collect doesn't have intrinsic value to it. It may not be about the events that the public is going to be most drawn to, right? If you do an event about the rainbow flag, the GLBT Historical Society is going to get visitors in their museum. If you do an event about Stonewall, the New York Historical Society is going to get people to come to that. Less interesting events in smaller cities may not be able to do that, but those stories have value too. And so I think Melissa's question about like, what did this object mean to you is so central because, you know, I once went to the World AIDS Museum. I think it's in Florida, and there's a great piece of material culture there. It's just a book of stamps. But with the story they're able to collect with oral histories, more context added by historians, trained historians who are doing contextual work, we found that this stamp collection was one of a gay man who died during the AIDS crisis. But these stamps were collected over his correspondence with lots and lots of his gay friends all over the world. And it had value. And that value tells us a lot about gay culture and the culture we lost because of the AIDS crisis in the 1980s. And I think without that historical context, that item may have been discarded. But because of that story, because of the legacy and the oral histories that were collected with that item means a lot more to a lot more people because of it. And so I think like the context certainly matters to many of these items.
That's so important. I think that's a crucial part of this whole process, is like understanding that these objects don't live alone. They tell you so much more about the world that created them and the world that preserved them. That's probably a good time for me to give a quick shout out. If you do have historic materials, and if you're on this call and alive, you do have historic materials, I want you to consider contributing them to an archive at some point. I think one of the takeaways that I'm getting from this is that it's not just the first rainbow flag, it's also the t-shirt you got from a bar fight, or not a bar fight, a bar event. Maybe a t-shirt that has some legacy of a bar fight. That would also be very historic. It could be a coaster, it could be a matchbook, it could be a stamp. All of these things, especially for queer people, I think are so important in revealing our story, because our stories are often not preserved or not told in other sources, in official documentation. And so it's very, very important for us to preserve those. If you're in the Bay Area and are looking for an archive, I happen to know a really good one, GLBT Historical Society. Just give us a Google. You'll find it pretty easily. We also got a question, Lee, if you're able to put it up quickly, about the Dameron guides. Yes. Do you know of any collections or exhibitions about the
So not currently. These guides are actually becoming rarer and rarer, and there's very few archives around the country that have full collections. I know at the One Archives in Los Angeles has one, but not currently. I'm news to the world. I'm currently I'm writing a book of a biography of Dameron and how these guides kind of bind and create a gay nation beginning in the 1960s. So I'm very, very interested in and hoping to get the public much more interested in these historical travel guides and the Mapping the Gay Guides collection, which is not digitizing them, but putting all these listings online for researchers to be able to explore, is something that I'm excited about and working right now, generously funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities. So
awesome. Thank you. We have about 1 minute left, so I don't want to keep everybody too late, but I do want to thank everyone again for your time and for sharing your expertise. Lee, if you can toss up the Rainbow Flag webpage. I encourage people to check it out. You can learn more about the original Rainbow Flag, as well as our new collecting project, to better document the context. As we've discussed, the context is so important, and there's so little documentation from 1978. If you have pictures, if you were there on that day, please send them to us. We can't wait to see them. With that, any final words are from our esteemed panel, Jim, Melissa, and Eric?
I just want to say Anita Bryan got a lot of shout out. I was doing an oral history recently, and I just want to say that in San Francisco, many bars, they stopped selling screwdrivers because it included orange juice, and they created the Anita Bryant cocktail, which was vodka and apple juice, which I thought was very clever. So a little nugget for you all there. So.
Great.
I'll make one tonight in your honor.
Thank you, Andrew.
Very good, very good. All right, well, thank you all so much. This has been fabulous.
Good night, all.
I hope
Thank
you've
you.
enjoyed
Good
the
night.
Lighthouse.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Have a great
And
night,
we hope
evening.
to see you all later.